This is a tilt-shift lens. This is me shifting a tilt-shift lens up and down. And this is why you need one if you shoot interiors and architecture. After I had been shooting spaces for a few years, I was working with a design build firm to photograph a kitchen. My camera was tethered to an iPad with a camera ranger, and while I was lining up the composition, there was a problem. We needed to see more of the floor and less of the ceiling. So I tilted the tripod head down, and the walls caved in. That's when I found myself in a super awkward and unprofessional predicament. As I was showing my client the composition on the iPad, I realized just how slanted the walls were. The image just looked ridiculous, and I was forced to tell them, I know these lines are super crooked, but I'll fix that in Photoshop, so don't worry, trust me. Just use your imagination right now to pretend like these walls are actually straight, okay? Basically, I had gotten to the point where my skills and level of professionalism had surpassed my equipment. So I bucked up and bought a tilt-shift lens. And then another, and then another. The tilt-shift lens has two functions, the tilt and the shift. The tilt part of the lens basically bends the lens from side to side. I'm honestly not sure when you'd ever use that, but I bet there are other videos out there covering this topic. I keep my tilt function locked and have never touched it. The shift function allows you to move the lens and what's in frame, left and right, and up and down without actually moving the camera. So what I want to show you today are the basics of these lenses as they pertain to interior and architecture photography. When I was shooting that kitchen with the design build client, I was able to fix the converging vertical lines in Photoshop. But the problem with doing this is you're essentially stretching the image and forcing the program to create new pixels out of thin air. So you lose a lot of quality in those areas you're stretching. In interior and architecture photography, pretty much the first and biggest rule is to keep your line straight. Vertical surfaces should remain vertical, and horizontal planes should be horizontal when you produce photos. No architect wants their buildings to look like they're falling over, and no general contractor wants their ceilings to look like they are slanted. So keeping all straight lines straight is the name of the game here. So with that said, when you use a tilt-shift lens, instead of tilting the tripod down to see more floor and less ceiling, you can level off the camera so the walls are straight, and then shift the lens down, and as a result, you'll show more floor while keeping your wall straight. With a tilt-shift lens, you can also rotate the lens so your shift function works side to side instead of up and down. This is great for single-point perspectives where you want to keep the horizontal line straight, but you also need to see a little bit more of either the left or the right side of the image. Because remember, if you pan the tripod left or right, then the horizontal lines look crooked, and we don't want that. Now, if your composition requires you to shift diagonally, meaning a little bit up and down and sideways, then you can also do that by rotating the lens into an in-between position. If you rotate 45 degrees, the lens snaps and locks into place. But between 90 and 45 degrees, there's no way to lock the lens off. So if your composition lands you in this zone, just be careful not to bump into anything when focusing or in between frames. In addition to using the basic shift functions like I just explained, another great application of a tilt-shift lens in A&D photography is what is called a stitched panorama. This is where you shoot part of a scene and then shift the lens and shoot another part of the scene, and then stitch the frames together in post. Again, because only the lens is moving and not the camera, the images should line up perfectly and will be easy to blend together. Why would you do this as opposed to just switching to a wider lens? Glad you asked. For one, you might not have a wider lens. Or you might just like the way this focal length looks better than the wide angle that has more distortion. If you haven't seen it already, you should go check out my other video where I go in depth on how ugly wide angle photos are and what you can do to avoid them. One thing to be aware of with tilt-shift lenses is that there's no autofocus, so you'll need to do all your focusing manually. Another thing you should know is that if you shift past this little line right here, you run the risk of overshifting. It's kind of hard to explain, but anything past that usually ends up looking a little bit wonky. It's difficult to pinpoint what it is exactly, but it just feels off, and for some reason it makes the viewer feel a little uncomfortable. Kind of like that weird uncle at family gatherings. One more consideration with these lenses is there's no option for a zoom. So with Canon lenses, you can get a 17, 24, and a 50mm tilt shift to cover most of your bases. You can also find a used 45mm as they don't produce those anymore. And there are longer versions of a 90 and a 135mm as well. With that said, you can give yourself a little more wiggle room in terms of zooming or focal lengths if you get a 1.4x and a 2x extender, which are little add-ons that will multiply the focal length of a lens by 1.4 and 2 respectively. I started out with the 24mm and both extenders, but after I realized how amazingly badass these lenses are, I went ahead and bought the 17 and 50mm as well. Why did I buy the 50mm instead of just using my 24 with the 2x extender? Again, glad you asked. The 1.4x extender takes away a stop of light, and the 2x takes away 2 stops of light. So if I'm shooting at 100 ISO, f13, and then I put the 2x on the camera, I'll have to either crank up the ISO, which I don't like to do because it adds more grain and digital noise, or bump down the f-stop, which I don't want to do because I like everything in the frame to be in focus, or I have to drag out the shutter speed super long. And that's fine sometimes, but when you're in a dark space and you add a circular polarizing filter, which takes away another stop of light, those exposures could end up being like 15 seconds long. And let's face it, ain't nobody got time for that. Also, the Canon 50mm tilt shift lens is insanely sharp, so it was totally worth it in my opinion.